Dialectics is this kind of method of cognition which other methods of cognition are not effectuating or are not implementing. And it's dialectics that enables you to dig through appearance.
Slavery, then join in the grand industrial band. Would you from misery and hunger be free, and come to your share like a man? There is power in a band of working men. From every land, then join the grand industrial. Then our share of this earth we shall demand. Come and do your share like a man. There is power, there is power in the band of working men. There is power that rule in every land. There is power, there's this power that rule in every land.
Welcome everyone to our renewed interview series here at the Midwestern Marx Institute. We have a very special first guest today, Dr. Keti Chukhrov. She is a guest professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Stuttgart. She is also the author of many books, including her latest, Practicing the Good, Desire and Boredom in Soviet Socialism, which we're going to be talking about a bit today. We'll also be talking to her about one of her recent articles, What Can Dialectics Change in the System, where she interacts critically with the second order cybernetics of Yuk Hui primarily. Dr. Chukhrov, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for invitation and your interest.
I want to start by asking you a little bit about your article, What Can Dialectics Change in the System? I found it a very insightful, work. Can you start by telling us, because I'm guessing that most of our audience is not familiar with cybernetics. It's not a topic that I believe we've touched before in any of our programs in the Midwestern Marx Institute. So what does Yuk Hui mean by cybernetics? How does he contrast it with his very, I think, peculiar understanding of dialectics, which seems to be reducing it to some sort of systemic recursivity? And can you describe the ways in which his account of dialectics leaves out the centrality of contradiction and development?
Thanks. Well, the figurants of the article are not only Yuk Hui, but also Marx, Lev Vygotsky, and Russian, Georgian, Soviet philosopher Merab Mamardashvili. And the main thing was to somehow reveal how dialectics functions. And when I bumped into this book, which is a brilliant book, actually, Recursivity and Contingency by Yuk Hui, I was amazed by his interpretation of dialectics to start with, but also by the fact that what he tries to do is not simply interest to cybernetics, but what he tries to do is to tell that the entire history of Western philosophy had been nothing but cybernetics. So how it is all effectuated. Actually, what is cybernetics for Yuk Hui? I mean, it's the feedback mechanism or feedback type of automation which allows unification of abstraction and meta. So it has a biological background, but at the same time, capacity for utmost abstraction, algorithmic abstraction. The point of Yuk Hui is that actually this duality that Western philosophy dealt with, and what is the duality? Matter and soul, think and thought, language and the world, subjectivity and objectivity. I mean, all those dualities at some point had been resolved in 20th century in the theories of technology, which is cybernetics. So in certain sense, instead of resolving this problem philosophically, the history of Western philosophy resolved it technologically. And this is what Heidegger speaks about when he says that the biggest danger when the being is forgotten, when the Dasein is impossible, and we come to Gestell, we come to this inframing, takes place precisely in technology. So he's suggesting that Western philosophy thereby could do nothing but this dualism of mechanicism and organicism. But what is his point? His point is that, yes, there is this recursivity. I mean, he claims that the unification of meta and idea, of meta and concept, of concretion and abstraction can take place only through cyclic development, which is recursive development. And there is, of course, the hope for contingency in philosophy. But his point is that philosophy could never effectuate the true contingency, that is Western philosophy. And the hope for true philosophy actually comes from new understanding of technology and new understanding of cybernetics, which is embodied in second order cybernetics. And I will explain why. And which comes as a hope for true contingency, for some sort of speculative technological mind from non-European treatment of technology, which is Chinese treatment of technology, which can unify in Daoism artistic element and technological element. So his point is that the true incomputable or the true paradox is there in second order cybernetics. And my argument and my motivation to dispute it was that dialectics is not recursivity. A contingency is not the main thing in philosophy, but it's much more exception in dialectics, and everything spins around in exception. Then even if we come to the incomputable, which is broadly discussed in cybernetic theory, as the capacity of cybernetics to self-learn and to generate from its own autopoiesis certain creativity, still it's the problem of the halt, it's the problem of glitch, it's the problem of error, but it's not the problem of drama, and not the problem of paradox, which Yuk Hui himself acknowledges when he says that this new understanding of technology is definitely not tragic and not dramatic. This was my motivation to start with Hui, but then it was important to explain that there are cybernetic times of systems which are positivist and which are grounded in literal treatment of signification, and this discrete literalness of its elements in signification is the core of its spinning, of its development. But what dialectics deals with is the indiscrete, incommensurable treatment of signification, which brings certain gray zones within systemics and systematics and allows it to incorporate and integrate nuances. I would say. This was the motivating start of first referring to this really extraordinary and important book by Yuk Hui, and only then trying to account for other methodology to build the systems, which the Marxist system actually is.
If I can ask a sub question before we get to our next topic of discussion. I haven't had a chance to engage with Huey's work or with cybernetics much, but it seems to me that part of what he seems to be doing is saying that dialectics doesn't account for certain things that I think most people who've engaged with the tradition would say that it does account for. For instance, what seems to be this assumption that there can't be a contingency and these breaks that restart things anew within dialectics, which is part of what's implied in reducing it to just this basic recursivity.
Mm-hmm.
I not no pun intended, but it's hard for me to compute that because for me, one of the central components of dialectics are those moments of leaps, those nodal points where a qualitatively new series of contradictions is instantiated. So, what do you think is? Am I onto something there? Does it seem like he's really just kind of just picking and choosing what components of the understanding of dialectics is how he's going to treat it, and thereby there's capacities that he's attributing to second order cybernetics that can actually be found perhaps in much more refined ways in dialectics?
Yes, good question. Actually, recursivity, what is recursivity? Recursivity is this cycle and development of cycles. So on the one hand, he is right to claim recursivity as the form of dialectics. And if you look at Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, definitely it is a cyclic work. It definitely has the recursive form. So he starts from one circle, then he rethinks it, and then returns to this circle again. So it's definitely recursive. The only thing is that what is his claim is that second order cybernetics is truly able to generate from this recursivity new cycles, novelty of the cycles. So somehow to exceed this dead recursivity by means of renovated type of recursivity by adding to it true contingency, because he's not only sticking to recursivity, but the capacity for contingency. As an impossibility for Western philosophy because it got stuck in its own technological form, in the technological forms of being, in extreme forms of blending mechanism and organicism. Another error, which I think is the point, that he squeezes dialectics and this problem of recursivity in dialectics into ontology, whereas dialectics is not simply ontological problem. And it's understandable because his main reference in contemporary philosophy is, of course, Heidegger. He departs from Heidegger's critique of technology and Heidegger's focus on the unconcealed, Heidegger's treatment of Dasein. But he doesn't mention that, for instance, Marxist philosophy has never been ontology. It has first and foremost been epistemological condition, so the condition of cognition. And this cognitive element had a transformative element, and transformation was first and foremost effectuated by the social agency. So what is missing there is this non-naturalized role of labor and non-naturalized, non-ontological agency of acting subjects in their collectivity, which the labor, for instance, is, and which culture, for instance, is, which already puts human sociality in an irreversible relation to nature. So there is this also argument between people who try to refurbish nowadays and to return back to new philosophies of nature and incorporate technology in this new philosophy of nature. Consequently, his terminology, organology, organicism, etc. And the socialist philosophy, which departs from Marx and the figures that I was referring to, Mamardashvili, Vygotsky, Ilyenkov, Lifshitz, who claim that there is a dramatic irreversibility between activity of human society, laboring society, and cultured society, where culture is not some sort of value and thesaurus, but culture is first and foremost the possibility of the common good. So in that sense, dialectics can be understood not simply as recursivity and not even as contingency, but as the non-identity, first and foremost. Non-identity, but at the same time, even more important than contradiction is probably something that Hegel calls Andersein. Andersein meaning that something is never literal with itself and it always has the other self. And this is history, right? History is something which does not allow you to completely freeze in your identity, because anything you have which is simply not natural has the origin and has production, consequently has history, and is not without labor. So in this sense, dialectics then is incorporating first and foremost the conflict of laboring societies and laboring society per se, and forming of consciousness by means of laboring society first and foremost, rather than the other way around, as in phenomenology, for instance. There is initial subjective consciousness and then introspection, introspective integration of the world into it.
Do you think that, and again, we had this plan of questions, but it's always so interesting once you get to the meat and potatoes of the conversation to not ask sub questions. But
You can refer me to the questions, of course.
do you think that having labor as such a central category in the understanding of dialectics, do you think that precludes an understanding of what's been traditionally called the dialectics of nature, which operates, of course, beyond beyond just labor? At least that's historically how it's been understood. You know, with a certain semblance of independence of from labor and from human social relations. And I mean, because sustaining labor as that central sounds very like early history and class conscious style Lukács.
Yes, yes, I understand what you mean. I mean, we have Engels's dialectics of nature, but dialectics of nature does not cancel and doesn't reject the diachronic possibility that labor will be incorporated in it. So the question that nature is already bearing in itself a dialectical capacity incorporates dialectics due to the inevitability of human presence in it. This dialectics of nature is not without human, but human is part of nature. I think the Marxist condition would be, okay, there has been nature without human, but wouldn't it be idiotic to claim that we know what it is? I mean, these are the new materialist or speculative materialist points, which come from Quentin Meillassoux and his very important book as well. But I would say that, I mean, I wouldn't be able to find potentiality in the development of treatment of total absence from nature of a human being. I wouldn't find it productive.
Okay. To move on to the subject more specifically of dialectics, which I think the ending components of your previous answer were a good segue for. There seem to be four central components that you highlight in your treatment of dialectics, those being epigenesis, diachronic historicity, development, and contradiction. I'm sure most of the viewers and listeners to this program are probably familiar with the latter two, which are more common features that are highlighted when people discuss dialectics. But can you specify how it is that you understand the relationship of epigenesis and diachronic historicity to dialectics itself, and How do you see the relationship of something like diachronic historicity to the method or epistemology of Marxism, which I would personally consider to be the ascension from the abstract to the concrete? But how do you see that relationship of diachronic historicity to the ascension to the concrete?
Yeah, big question indeed. And I mean, you cannot with one answer account for dialectics altogether, but let's try to just speculate aloud. Well, definitely development has to do with diachronic historicity already, because I mean, development is incorporated in history. Genesis and epigenesis um, is something that is rarely mentioned, but this is an important point for Ilyenkov as well as for Lev Vygotsky, who tried to see the dialectics of development of speech, and by means of observing the development of speech in the development of children, he tried to observe how thought and capacity for thinking is generated. So one of his interpretation is that Aufhebung, which is an important term for sublation, right? For dialectical process and dialectical procedure is also preservation, but also burying something. So when you bury something, you also preserve it. So not only you cancel and throw it away, but you are just not using something having preserved it. So this is a very good metaphor also for dialectics, which he tries to correlate with such concept as involution. Involution meaning that, and it also deals with dialectics of nature, by the way, that not only you can predict the next stage in the previous stage. For instance, you are in the present stage, but the dialectics is that you already predict certain developmental othering of this element or of this phenomenon or of this thing. But in the present thing, you can detect, and this detection is very important, you detect the previous stages. So what is important is that not only the future stage is important, but for the treatment of the future state, we have to preserve the previous stages. And you cannot simply reject the previous stages. And this is the complexity of dialectics. And this is what Deleuze was against. Because, you know, dialectics is like, imagine that you are climbing the ladder, but two ladders, standing with one leg on one ladder and with another, and you have to keep them both, right? So in certain sense, when you go to the next stage, it's like you have to keep the rope and some weight of the previous, and it's really difficult. It's like a Hercules. You should be a Hercules of spirit to keep this possibility. And he nevertheless he claims that this diachronicity, so not simply synchronicity as the structuralism decided to do. We have the sign, we have the semiology, so let's deal with this sign. We are not interested with what was the meaning before, what was the meaning at all, what is its reference with certain essences, but let's keep the separation of abstraction with the thing. But the bonds which the semiology and which the sign has with the thing, but at the same time, the bond which the meaning has with the previous meanings and history of the meanings. And some sort of engravement of the previous conditions in the contemporary conditions, which is activity first and foremost, right? Because the meaning is produced by certain forms of acts. So materiality and meta is not a dead matter, which is like, I don't know, geological matter. But matter is first and foremost certain event of activity.
Yeah, it's I like the image you use, this Herculean task um of holding on in certain ways to that which has been overcome, that which has been sublated. In many ways, the more material aspects of life, it's done somewhat more spontaneously. At the level of culture, I think it's where it begins to get a little bit difficult. And I think of always this quote from Lenin and a speech he gives to the Youth League, where he tells them, "Look, if you just remember communist slogans, you're not going to be a good communist. If you just know communist texts, you're not going to be a good communist. You got to drink from the fountain of knowledge of the history of mankind." And that's always
Mhm.
some of the more difficult stuff to understand and see where you're at in light of what has already transpired, in light of how that has uh, developed into what currently exists. um
May I have a comment, a small
yeah, of
comment?
course.
This was also one of the reasons of the quarrel between Lenin and Bogdanov.
Hmm.
Uh, Alexander Bogdanov, who wrote a very important work, Empiriomonism and Tautology. And I mean, the argument between them was, what is scientific treatment? Is it a dialectical treatment of sociality and philosophic treatment, or improvement and bettering and development of society can simply be organized as management, as isomorphic management? And the idea of Bogdanov was that these isomorphic conditions, which is actually, it's antecedent theory which is anticipating cybernetics to a
Hmm.
certain extent, because it's also a positivist theory claiming that there is a certain isomorphism between biological, social, and scientific elements, and there are these assemblages of the of different hybridities which are discrete quantities. But what is dialectics is that there are no discrete quantities, because discrete quantities at certain leap or at certain event, they turn into new qualitative condition, which changes the aspect and the angle with which you look at the world, and doesn't enable you to reverse back. Nevertheless, you keep these previous Andersein of the world to move back, to move forth, with this luggage or baggage that you already have.
Yeah, that's very interesting. In connection, well, one of my favorite parts of the articles was when you draw out those homologies that exist between Bogdanov and contemporary cybernetics. One of the uh, things that I read as part of the purpose of your article is making this point of demarcation between, I guess, two different approaches that you can take to a systematic method, or a systems thinking, or just thinking systematically. Um, you argue, and this is a quote from your article, that Marxism in many ways combines systematic method with dialectical analysis in political economy, social psychology, and thought. Is it fair to say that one of the central contrasts you see in, for instance, the philosophy of Marxism and Huey cybernetics, or perhaps also in structuralism, post-structuralism, and automation, is that between a dialectical and non-dialectical systems theory?
Um, yes, definitely, you are right. Dialectics in this case would be the attitude to the world, the attitude to decipher the world. But more important is what stands behind dialectics. because if we look at what is lacking in this kind of cybernetic systems, it will be time and capacity for meaning and certain bond with reality. So the demand that the signification or certain type of what appears reverberates the world or somehow reflects it. So it's also the theory of reflection, of how to reflect the world and what to reflect, right? Dialectics is this kind of method of cognition which other methods of cognition are not effectuating or are not implementing. That's why dialectics. Also, dialectical method and the examples which I provided in the cases of Vygotsky and in the cases of Mamardashvili, they help to dig through appearances. And it's dialectics that enables you to dig through appearance. How Marx managed to dig through appearances of commodity form, how he managed to dig through appearance of capitalist production, to see in this capitalist production certain core. And the core that he saw was simply the exchange method between non-monetary or rather non-monetary exchange, when there was no surplus value meant yet. And nevertheless, already in this simple exchange of one thing to another thing, he already sees this surplus interest. And due to this diachronic method that he is not simply using the contemporary elements of capitalism to analyze it, but he returns back to some kind of genesis, to origin of value. And due to this very historic genetic or epigenetic method, tries to invent and discover something in contemporary appearance of surplus value and in contemporary appearance of how labor functions.
I'm compelled to ask a question of Shishekian sorts. You mentioned that part of the power, if you wish, of dialectics as a theory of cognition is its ability to go beyond appearance and grasp something that remains hidden. One of the ways, of course, I'm sure you know that Zizek is understanding the Marxist approach, or even Lacanian psychoanalysis, is in this renewed understanding of the relationship of appearance to essence, or form to contact, where the goal is not the traditional piercing through the form and appearance to get at something hidden behind, but in understanding the secret of the form itself. The way in which there's this seeming to seem that's operative in appearance, that's a constitutive moment of the essence itself. What would you say to a retort of that nature?
Thanks for asking this question, because it's crucial what you said, that indeed, I mean, Zizek and Zizek's treatment of both psychoanalysis and Hegel, and he's Hegelian, is very important, because he gives lots of clues of how to treat Hegelian dialectics non-essentially. And showing that already in semiology, I mean, we have only semiology. Yes, we rely on Lacan, but Lacan is a classical post-structuralist, or even, I mean, not yet a complete post-structuralist, but still remaining in this structuralist paradoxes. And so Zizek's treatment is that we cannot afford being essentialists and claim that there is some kind of meaning behind the signification. And this is the reason why he criticizes Ilyenkov. This is the reason why he calls it a pre-modernist or pre-postmodernist philosophy. And I think he wouldn't agree with their interpretation of Marx and Hegel, claiming that actually they are returning back metaphysics, because they claim that there is some kind of correspondence between signifier and signified. But well, I will try to a little bit explain how it functions with Vygotsky and with Mamardashvili. I mean, what is the main discovery of Vygotsky, but also of Mamardashvili and also of Ilyenkov in their treatment of Marx, that you know, what was the structuralist discovery? They said, we don't want to be metaphysicians, we don't want to be essentialists. Let's get rid of the signified. Let's get rid of something that claims the meaning. Let's get rid of the hope that there will be a stable, somehow ontologized meaning behind the sign. Let them be separate, and the meanings will be random. So the signification will be random. What are people like Deleuze and Derrida doing? They are claiming that no, it's not interesting, because we again have the dichotomy of things which we rejected. So, okay, we don't want to describe the world, because I mean, the language doesn't describe the world. It's like really a metaphysical pretension that with your signs, you can describe this incommensurability of objecthood. But let's toss around the things and the significations. So everything will be this signification. And hence you have Deleuzian and Guattarian assemblages, seriality, and then if everything is this post-semiology, then everything is incorporated. So they were against this structuralist exclusion of affectivity, of body, because we have to include it, right? But we cannot include it as certain thing that we are endowing with meaning. Therefore, we again have this post-semiology somehow remains in the semiological totality to a certain extent, right? And I mean, Deleuze manages to create this super surface or meta surface due to eventuality, but this is another topic. The main thing is that in capitalism and schizophrenia, they claim that no, we cannot tell what is behind appearances. We only have appearances, but even the things are appearances. How can you claim that what is behind appearance is less appearance than the appearance itself? So everything is the simulacrum to a certain extent. And then we are in this inferno. And this is the this is the cave. So instead of stepping out of the cave like the Plato's cave, and that's why Deleuze criticizes Plato in his idea that certain dialectical point will come to the moment of truthfulness to see the idea in new light, and you see this light. No, let's remain in labyrinth is the idea of Deleuze, because there is no heaven and earth and under earth, but there is this big cosmosis of all things together. And then we return back to certain new kind of nature philosophy. Well, Deleuze differs from it a little bit because he brings tragedy again, but still I wouldn't touch it at the moment. But what is the point of dialecticians is that, what is their argument? Imagine that the reason why you think so, the reason why you are so pessimistic, the reason why you see everything in this totalized cave is because you have no opportunity and possibility but living in capitalism. So imagine that the reason why you consent to live in this kind of total inferno deluxe, I would say, because capitalism is luxus, is because you simply rely on objects which are produced by means of surplus value, which look like commodities. And we don't have any objects which were not commodities. Do we? No, we do not. Even our bodies is produced due to and by means of surplus value. And nowadays, when we look at even new robotics and new ideas of your body, new forms of knowledge and acquisition of those knowledge, we deal with this phantasmagoria. And imagine that we return back to the cave and transform something in this production so that the objects are produced in a different way. And then you can dig through them and you can detect by means of Marxist analysis of capital that the problem was in the form of labor, in the form of temporality of labor, in the form the surplus was imposed on the value. And hence the theory of use value from Marx, which is not simply exchange and which is totally out of exchange. But then Mamardashvili also ruminates about this capacity of objects to acquire meaning and to acquire their concept when they are not commodities anymore, and when they had not been converted by means of surplus value production, which would change their appearance. And when there is no commodity, it would change the total systemic condition of the entire sociality, activity, and being. So, I mean, it's like in a computer game or in a domino, like you change one point and then everything like changes over. And
Well, especially when it's the cell form of the system. When it's the cell form of the system, the change is what can produce everything with it. If it was just another random thing, it'd be hard, but it's the central germ.
Yeah, it's the central germ. And so one little change would entail other changes. And I think that this condition that there had been revolution was crucial. It was the organizing principle of the theory of reflection, the organizing principle of also of the theory of the ideal of Ilyenkov, which claims that cybernetics, or simply this assemblage of all things together in cosmosis, is not the only way of connection, is not the only way of critiquing a rigid system, because, I mean, Deleuze also criticizes a rigid system. And his system is already seriality and diagrammatic fugitivity, etc. But another method of uniting the body and abstraction, the body and concept, is dialectics, and not necessarily contingent performativity.
Very interesting. One of the other things that I found quite special about your article is that in making this defense of dialectics, you reference a series of thinkers that some of which are becoming more well known in recent years, others of which are still not very much known in the West. For instance, Lev Vygotsky, I think it's perhaps the most well-known one, but very specialized in the field of psychology. I've spoken to various friends who studied psychology, and they had no idea Lev Vygotsky was a communist theoretician. They perform this epoche where they completely separate the political context of his writing often, but he's fairly well known. There's a sort of Ilyenkov renaissance going on in the West with the International Friends of Ilyenkov was one of the groups that I found some years ago. I found, for instance, Ilyenkov through a Cuban philosophy professor, Rubén Sadoya, because Ilyenkov was very popular in Cuba. And I started reading him in Spanish maybe half a dozen or so years now. Mikhail Lifshitz, I haven't seen too many people talk about. I read his Karl Marx's Philosophy of Art some time ago, and it was very interesting. And some of his critiques of Picasso and very Lukácsian style critiques of irrationalism and art. And Mamardashvili, I've first encountered through your text. I haven't heard of him. I hadn't heard of him before, so I very much appreciate this wide variety of different, more unknown thinkers in the West that you approach with seriousness, because a lot of these thinkers, the Western Academy doesn't adopt and give anywhere near the same attention it gives to some of its own capitalist, anti-capitalist radicals, if you wish. But to switch to the topic of practicing the good, desire, and boredom in Soviet socialism, your recent book, I've lost count, honestly, how many times I've cited one of the phrases that you produced there in that book that I think really captures the ethos of so-called anti-capitalism in the Western, again, so-called left and its theorists. You write that, quote, "The capitalist undercut of these emancipatory and critical theories functions not as a program to exit capitalism, but rather as the radicalization of the impossibility of this exit." Can you outline some of the ways you see this occurring? What do you think it's rooted in? For instance, one of the more popular frameworks of analyzing what it's rooted in today is someone like Gabriel Rockhill's theory of the global theory industry, and the political economy of knowledge, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the promotion of this compatible left of sorts. Others have seen it rooted as the theory that emerges from the PMC or something, the professional managerial class. So what do you see it rooted in? And in what ways is it the anti-capitalism of the Western left still thoroughly capitalist?
Also another big question. But may I a little bit add to your previous question of about Zizek? I think I didn't completely answer it. What is important for all those philosophers which you mentioned, and you mentioned that you didn't know about Lifshitz or Mamardashvili before, is the critique of formalization. So what is formality? It is literalness of form. And if we claim that the form is not equaling itself, and it's also in Hegelian sense and in Marxist sense, also the otherness to itself and other, then we have to claim that it's not simply, it cannot simply called form. And that's why all kinds of extreme formalism, including semiological formalism or cybernetic formalism, were criticized in this logic. But continuing Zizek's, your question about Zizek, I mean, what was Lacan's main statement that unconscious is organized as language, right? And we cannot go behind this language because the imaginary is also language. Maybe the real can go beyond language, but even the real is unattainable because it simply, I mean, it brings to an impasse. It's not a productive condition. So what is productive condition is this form, exactly, and only form. But what was the point of all of them, Lifshitz, Mamardashvili in his analysis, or Ilyenkov first and foremost, and other psychologists who were disciples of Lev Vygotsky, that what stands behind unconscious is not, what stands behind consciousness is not unconscious, but what stands behind the development of human consciousness and human capacity to think, when Lev Vygotsky observes the child, is the generalization, is the universal, is the ideal. But this ideal is even antecedent to language. So why they criticized the form of language, the post-structuralists? Because language brings you the stable meanings, etc. It universalizes some affectivities which are beyond the language. But he claims that what is beyond the language is even more general, is even more generalized. And affectivity and affective cognition of the world is the ideal because it is activity, and activity already that stands behind the language, which has not yet attained the language. And he shows that the child has this internal type of internal speech which is trying to reach the concept, reach the linguistic concept. But this thinking is already the ideal, is already cultural, is already about capacity to generalize. So this is an extreme topic, and I had to mention it to have yet another reference and context.
Would you say, if I may real quick, would you say that that level, that treatment that you have in Ilyenkov, of the ideal, or in Vygotsky, would you say is somewhat homologous to Heidegger's understanding of being in the world?
No,
And
not at all. Absolutely. It's counter. I mean, no, not at all. Because Heidegger still, I mean, he's a thinker of ontology, and he's not a thinker of sociality. And there are lots of questions like yours, because immediately when you say that there is certain meaning, or there is certain universality or generalization beyond the language or behind the language, this is the immediate question. Do you mean Heidegger? Yeah, but no, I mean, Lifshitz was very often accused of his Heideggerianism, but nevertheless, it was not about Heideggerianism, but it was about thinking capacity of a human species, which thinks even when the language is not yet acquired. This is the point of Vygotsky, that the child, due to this internal speech, which is not yet language, is already a thinker. And there are lots of very revolutionary consequences to this, which claim that even on the level of the capacity of a primitive person to draw with the hand, or to express the sentence, still being unable for proposition, like classical syntactic proposition, there is the thought. Maybe this thought is poetic, a little bit poetic, but still it's already capacity to generalize and to culturalize, I would say. So just this complement to what we discussed. Now answering the question about the radicalization of the impossibility of the exit from the capitalism. Yeah, I was thinking a lot about it when I was writing the book, and also if we think about the contemporary left, maybe we have to make distinction between the leftist activism, which is organizational leftist activity, which probably you belong to. But I have collaborated a lot with the cultural left, which belong to artistic left. And sometimes I get amazed, and I am amazed by those statements and beliefs that cultural left reproduce. And my point was that very often the forms of emancipation suggested by cultural left, they hinge on desire and hinge on certain subversive forms of enjoyment. And therefore, it's not clear how they are, yes, they can rejuvenate the body, they can somehow find creative forms of collectivity, but to what extent they can transform economics, and sociality broadly is not clear. This is one thing. Another thing is that certain things are about indulgence and alienation of alienation. And Deleuze describes this very well. But Deleuze is an optimist which is seeing pessimism of capitalism optimistically, and which is agreeing for this uncanny condition. The others, they look at the uncanny condition of capitalism, they look at the negative condition of capitalism, and instead of calling this extreme monstrous intensification of capitalism still capitalist, because this was art. I mean, this was post-structuralist treatment of capitalism when they claimed that we should intensify capitalism to make it more creative. But this did not mean exit from capitalism. This meant just victory over capitalism by means of capitalism. And they were aware of this negative condition. Contemporary cultural left, they forget that this negativity existed and that this was the harshest form of capitalism within capitalism. And they call it emancipation. And they call it new commonality, new commons, new communism, etc. Therefore, I would not say that I give a recipe of exit from capitalism, not at all. What was my idea that maybe you try to find capitalism not in your Regierung meaning government of Germany, but not only that, yes, they are capitalist, but maybe they are less capitalist, at least because they still contain Social Democratic Party, than you as the artist, which is in the forms of creativity of capitalism. So maybe it's important to inspect your own capitalism, which is not done. I mean, this self-critique of why I am capitalist, why I cannot exit, why I am sticking in this negativity, which the modernist artists, they could do. The artists like Baudelaire, I mean, it was about that. The artists like Benjamin tried to exit it through technology, through the travel to avant-garde early Soviet period, and still hoping that the exit would be possible. But then comes Adorno and says, no, this exit is not possible. Then come Lyotard and Deleuze. These are really honest guys. The honest are also those who create activism within capitalism, being aware of it. The honest are also social democratic people who say, okay, sorry, we can only exist in capitalism, but we shall be organizing certain institutional katechon against capitalism, like Castoriadis, for instance, when he tried to build institutions. But sometimes the contemporary left, they are accusing more official institutions, remaining in this bubble of cultural artistic production and thinking that they know what socialism is. So this was my critique.
Well, you had mentioned earlier, in reference to Deleuze, the cave, and the labyrinth, and it does seem to be that the structure in which their anti-capitalism or anti-capitalist escape of the cave seems to take is that they escape by taking a detour back in, through these different forms of considering almost like transgressiveness for its own sake to be revolutionary and more revolutionary than, I don't know, the Soviet Union or any of the actual projects of the construction of socialism in the 20th century. And it's kind of interesting because this used to be primarily a leftist thing. I think in the recent decade and some change, I'm very much convinced by the work of someone like Angela Nagel, who has seen the spread of this transgressiveness also in the right wing, which does seem, especially in the West now, to be considering itself as a form of dissidence against the system. I've
Sure.
seen this strange phenomenon in the last few years where no one wants to affirm that they're the hegemony. Everyone wants to act as if someone else is the real hegemonic power, and
Absolutely.
everyone is subaltern. It's almost like the necessity of hegemony taking a seemingly counter hegemonic form. But I see this phenomenon of the obsession with transgressiveness and the transgression specifically of norms that are not just reducible to a capitalist ontics, intimately tied with how these people see authority or authoritarianism. There's this comment that I believe Boris Groys makes, that this politics of anti-authoritarianism, abstract anti-authoritarianism, it's very similar to the structure of capital, because capital is that which makes that melts everything into air, that goes dissolving traditional bonds of authority and whatnot. And I see that spirit of critique in how you treat the Western left. It's this attempt to just rebel, this abstract rebellion. And in doing it, it always reproduces the logic of capitalism itself in ways in which are not just compatible. There's this term from the CIA agent Thomas Braden. He called that sort of left the compatible left, the one that the State Department was okay with. I'd go as far as to call them the indispensable left, because they're the ones that the State Department would want people going towards in moments of crisis, because it's not going to do anything other than reproduce the system, maybe challenge family norms or norms about gender and sexual identity and all these different things, but not the structure of capital itself. Do you see any of that in there? Do you see it connected to this sort of vague, abstract, very liberal tinted left anti-authoritarianism?
Uh, it's very important problems also in reference to the catastrophic condition of nowadays with the wars, right? The war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza. So what is this catastrophe about? I mean, what this catastrophe is revealed? That the left have no power. Precisely, they have no hegemony. They achieved enormous potentialities in terms of creative work, enormous virtual ideas and imaginative ideas and imaginaries about emancipation, but the real political act which would change or alleviate somebody's suffering is not in their hands. They don't have the bridles to read. So how should these bridles be developed? Should they take part in real politics? No, they don't want, because they hate social democracy. So the critique is that we don't even want to be social democratic. And I remember when I was myself criticizing social democracy that it's not socialist. They would say that Soviet socialism, the left, cultural left, would say that, oh, Soviet socialism is state capitalism. And I mean, social democracy has more development into revolution, etc. Nevertheless, they would not take part in governmental social democracy. Now, when social democracy would help and would participate in certain decisions, all decisions are wrong for them, right? At the same time, they want to remain in this bohemian bubble when they don't want to make any decisions, and when this I am totally all for woke politics. I support woke politics. I just want to say that woke politics cannot change capitalist economy, right? And the care politics also, they don't change, transform governments. But maybe it's high time to get out from this, from this institutional, quasi-institutional bubble, which used to be productive for 30 years. When the Soviet Union was over, for these 30 years, it was extremely productive. But the cultural left were terribly ignoring the legacies of socialism. They would not pay attention to it. And now when they say we are socialists, we are not accepting social democracy, which is capitalist and which is, I don't know, which wants the NATO back. Okay, you want real socialism? Just abolish private property. Can you? You cannot. So the point is, we are Mensheviks. We cannot exit this. So how to be aware that we are Mensheviks? Because can you be Bolshevik? Can you go for it? I mean, then be honest. We are Mensheviks. So this was my point.
That reminds me very much of a comment that Zizek makes, that the left today is very much Fukuyama in character. It accepts the thesis that liberal democracy is the end of history. For us, I'm a young person in the United States. I'm 27 at this point, and the last 10 or 12 years of my life have been focused on a lot of activism and organizing and thinking about what is it that's wrong? Because in the country that I'm in, people keep getting poorer, more indebted, more desperate, and conditions objectively seem very good for, revolutionary struggle, but there's virtually no left, especially no sovereign left, no left that has its own institutional skeletal body and that can function as a real force in politics. So the critique of Western Marxism and the Western left has always been central for my own thinking as a scholar, for the Institute. In many ways, it's one of the defining features, reflecting self-critically, because after all, it's the left we inherit. Where has the left gone wrong? Because the usual operation is to blame working people. They're too backwards, or they're too racist, or they're too this. And what the leftists don't like doing is thinking about the ways in which perhaps they're the ones that in many ways are backward or are dealing with paradoxes of their own.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, the main thing is, what are transformative potentialities and what are the communicative potentialities? I mean, what is my fault and what I accuse myself in, if I remember that we were leftist and we were writing about leftist texts and we were producing leftist books, etc., and translating them. But the main thing that happened in Russia, for instance, and which brought to this catastrophe was that the middle class was liberal and the leftist class was the class representing culture and knowledge.
Mhm.
I mean, evacuation of knowledge is the evacuation of knowledge from the simple people, or just subtracting knowledge and culture from the layman, is the capital of all right-wing governments, which they rely on, and by means of which they effectuate now the I mean, actually canceling cultural left, canceling liberal left, and generally forming their pyramid of their power. So we missed the left, and I, I mean, I imply myself and blame and accuse myself as well, is the continuity of discourse. What discourse to speak with the other layers of society, which are not part and parcel of your common body of production. Yeah, so maybe this is the tragedy and this is the missed opportunity, at least if I refer to Eastern European context and former Soviet, former socialist context. Georgia and Russia, the two countries of my origin.
For us, just to explain briefly where it is that we're coming from, we saw part of the downfall and limitations of the left rooted one in their class position, in the sort of middle class professional background that operated with a way of being in the world and a discourse that was very alienating to regular working class people, and they were fundamentally unable to translate leftist
Yeah.
discourse in a way that was grasped by regular people, even at times like the ones where we have today, where I would say most Americans would be interested in hearing ideas that come from the communist tradition, especially when they're not phrased in the way in which this sector of society that has been identified with left wing the last 40, 50 years has been taught to phrase it institutionally, because there's a lot of institutional backing for how certain forms of discourse are framed. And then I also felt this strange impression that I see also echoed in your book, that for them nothing is socialist. So socialism is, or communism is, this idea that exists purely in their head, and nothing in the world is actually
Yeah,
socialist. And
but
they end
mhm.
up operating with this outlook. I've called it the purity fetish, where if something doesn't live up to that pure idea of what they conceive to be socialism that exists in their head, it's considered not socialist and therefore not supported. And it replicates itself in various ways. There's a lot of individual leftists in the US, for instance, that talk about socialism as abolishing the United States or America or something like that, which is just complete national nihilism. There's others that say that the whole 40% of the working class have voted for Trump is just fascist and should be completely dismissed and not even spoken to. They're not pure enough. They're not the pure, enlightened, liberal subject that they want in the working class, so they're rejected. One of the most insightful things I get from your book, which frankly, from academic spaces, we don't get a lot of. I think maybe you and Boris Groys are two of the individuals that I know that actually do this in a way that's quite insightful, is that you don't negate the experience of the Soviet Union as socialism. I'm sure you're critical. I'm sure there's probably many things that we disagree on in our reading of the Soviet Union, but there's a basic acknowledgement that it was a qualitatively new type of society, that it brought forth, as you kind of describe it in your book, it instantiated a new ontology and a new ontics. in ways in which hasn't been studied at all by the Western left, precisely because they don't think it's socialist. They reduce it to some bureaucratic or state or totalitarian form of capitalism or whatever. So what do you think what do you think is missed by leftists, people who actually want to bring about a new world when such a incredible experience as what was seen in the Soviet Union, I would consider also to be seen in other countries as well, but specifically in the Soviet Union, what's missed in the face of this nihilism? What lessons are not taken in, and how do those lessons help us also retroactively see the capitalist anti-capitalism of the Western left?
Yeah, you were right when you mentioned Boris Groys, because it was his statement first that actually, yes, on the one hand, we should agree with Althusser that what took place after revolution and also due to Stalinism and due to very mutated form of socialism, we cannot take it as an example to completely follow, but there has been no other socialism per se. So no other experience which would experiment on the new political-economic condition, a political-economic condition which criminalized capital, right? And the question for me is not to idealize Soviet Union, because I lived a certain part of my life in Soviet Union. I wouldn't say that it was just embodiment of happiness, but we have, I mean, what was the point which I tried to develop in my book, that there are certain epistemes. These epistemes, they are like formulas, and they entail certain consequences. I mean, and this ontic condition which changes due to production is also this kind of epistemic formula which functions immediately. So if you rely yourself on dialectics and not on positivist logic, then you cannot cancel past, which means you cannot rely on purely avant-garde aesthetics. You have to somehow bear on the rope the previous periods and previous stages, thereby.
If I may, real quick, that's one of the central points that comes from Lenin's critique of proletkult.
Yes, yes. Likewise, if you rely that you cannot totally accept a formalism of sign, you have to look at reality. Because, I mean, what is modernism? Modernism is like, we don't care about reality. It's not possible to reflect it. Moreover, what stays in reality is total capitalism. It's totally perverse. Why we should look at this reality, it's even more perverse than I mean, what to look at on nature, which is contaminated by terrible ecology, etc. What to look at, where is this reality? Where can we find it? It's already contaminated with all those perverse conditions of capitalist production. Nevertheless, the condition when you imply meaning in signification necessitates this bond, the umbilical cord with reality, the umbilical cord with event. And I'm just saying that, I mean, these formulas of epistemology, they work immediately. Then if you don't make a commodity attractive, it means that there are certain bodies that are produced by this kind of material culture. And on the one hand, the question is it miserable? Yes, it can be miserable, because for a for capitalist eyesight or capitalist perspective, these people live in extreme poverty. But then the question is not about I like it or not, but the question is that it functions. And the question is that my first and foremost, my question is, be careful when you demand socialism. Are you ready for this, and this? So this was the point. Also, we should be careful when we immediately claim ourselves communists and we immediately accept, oh, let's have use value. But I'm now, for instance, researching Marx's analysis and Marx's theory of use value. And you know, it's very rigid. If we imagine the society with such use value, I don't know whether people who are used to contemporary Instagram culture would be ready to live in this rigidity. So, I mean, we are speaking about this more realistic understanding that, you know, ideas function, ideas work. And if you embody one concept, it will entail certain consequences, which will be telling on sociality and on reality.
Yeah, one of the, just real quick, because I want to be respectful of your time, but one of the more interesting parts of the book was the discussion on boredom. And I've seen
What? Sorry?
on boredom, yeah. I've seen, you know, a person, as someone who's Cuban, was born in Cuba, uh, one of the interesting things that I find as someone who does support the Cuban Revolution and still supports the government, not uncritically, but uh, a lot of my peers in the U.S. who come from Cuban heritage are, of course, extremely anti-Cuba. I mean, there's a whole industry to be anti-Cuba and anti-communist, specifically in South Florida. But one of the interesting things that I always hear is that the blockade is in the mind. So this very real, objective economic blockade that the U.S. imposes on Cuba, supposedly is just something in the mind. And the only way that I can understand how someone gets to a point like that is that they grow up being told something, and then at some point they just get bored. And the even if the reason is true, boredom is a very strong force for changing people's judgments and alignments, etc. You have a very interesting also analysis of boredom, almost like a category, an interpretive category, also to understand part of what happened in the Soviet Union. Can you talk a little bit about how you understand boredom and the role that it played in the Soviet experience?
Well, yes, it was a bit romantic. It was a little bit romanticized and metaphoric, concept. But yes, I mean, boredom is something that brings absolutely free time without the main thing that capitalism owns. And what is that capitalism owns? It is competition, initiative, and implementation of desire and following desire. So these are things that are not functioning in non-surplus production or non-libidinal production. I called it, I just overturned the principle of libidinal production into the non-libidinal production, which brings to sociality which is not about enjoyment anymore and not about this correlation of desire and lack. And of course, one of the main notions was sexuality. That's why I find, you know, this emancipatory interpretations of sexuality as embodiment of socialism, very suspicious. Not because there was no sex in socialism. There was a lot of sex in socialism, but because sexuality is something else. And thereby, if you subtract all those things, you remember we lived in pandemic, right? And all of a sudden during the pandemic, lots and lots of desires were castrated, right? Or rather, it was not castration, it was circumcision. So it was circumcision of desire. So in certain sense, you know, this is a circumcised society. It's holy in terms of it's not capitalism because it doesn't have the sin of capitalism, but it's also circumcised and therefore boring. So is this boredom bearable? This is the question, and this was the question which I put also to myself.
Yeah, and for a lot of the capitalist, anti-capitalist subjects of the West, it doesn't seem to be a boredom that is bearable. Dr. Chukhrov, thank you so much for your time. This has been a very
Hello,
insightful
Carlos.
conversation. It's been a pleasure to start off this new series of interviews, conversing with you. Is there anything you would like to plug before we stop the recording?
No, maybe you would share the recording with me before editing or after editing, and it would be nice. And thanks a lot for your insightful questions. It was a pleasure to have this conversation.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much.